I want to thank Ulla for inviting me to work on this conference. As you probably noticed, I'm not from this university, so it was a great pleasure to be brought to the team and work together. And in terms of my presentation, I actually wanted to take a step back and look at gender and other issues here from the wider perspective, namely the politics of identity. I hope I will take a position also of a devil's advocate, so maybe some of the things which I tell you will be not to taste of some of you, particularly those who somehow feel that what they are doing is the most important thing in the world, or don't like to look at it in a wider context, and maybe because this context also will be somehow rejected by you. But this also reflects what I'm doing as I look at various aspects of identity, and usually from the perspective of socialism, which I bring to this presentation. I know I need to hurry up, but do I still have 10 minutes or maybe less? 10? 7 or something? Okay, let's start then. So, again, forgive me if I say something obvious, but genderism, or whatever however we describe what we try to do here, is part of discourse of identity politics. So identity politics, or identitarian politics, refers to political positions based on the interests and perspectives of social groups with which people identify. They can be based on such factors as gender, sexuality, race, disability, age, nationality, occupation, and class. However, in the current discourse, identity politics is typically contrasted with class politics. Class is also obviously a marker of identity. I think that this is the most important marker of identity, but there is a reason for treating class differently than these other markers. Arguably because it's easier to transcend one's class position than sexuality or gender. And I would argue that there are two goals of identity politics, or maybe there are more than that, but I think there are the two, I would say, meta goals. One is, and this is perhaps the goal which we identify with the first wave of feminism, is ending discrimination, achieving equality by the oppressed or marginalized groups, fight for the right to abortion, gay marriage, employment after achieving retirement age are examples of this fight. But there is a different goal which I believe in the British discourse on identity politics probably prevails now, and this I will describe as a call to repay for the crimes committed by the privileged group, typically white heterosexual men, or reversing the situation of exclusion by excluding those who previously used their right to exclude. And this is reflected, for example, in such initiatives as creating safe spaces, perhaps you're familiar with this term, for example, for black people, women-only festivals or conferences only for women, while vigorously criticizing institutions such as Men's Club. So I would, on the basis of that, I would say that there are two roads to identity politics. One is towards universal equality, and such position is usually linked to socialism. For example, feminist socialist, typical of Britain of the 60s, certainly strongly belongs to this approach. And there is the second towards exceptionalism of the oppressed group. And again, I will argue that such position prevails in contemporary times, certainly in Britain, where different groups compete for the most victimized award. So in the UK, it can be linked to changes which took place in the 80s, also the decade where postmodernism was somehow brought into mainstream cultural studies, when the politics of multiculturalism was introduced, and with that came competition for resources to develop and protect interests of specific groups. And I strongly link this politics of identity to postmodernism. because I will argue that this is a child of postmodernism marked by the loss of dominant political subjects such as the people or proletariat, and fragmentation of the political scene leading to one-cause movements. And in my view, such fragmentation helps the hegemony of neoliberalism, as the conflicted groups typically do not question the rationale behind class inequality, only demand that these inequalities are sort of justly distributed among different categories of people, black and white, female and male, hetero and homosexual, or that the oppressed minority group suffers a bit less than others. So, just to fast forward a bit, there are two types of identity politics and relations towards socialism. I would say type 1 of identity politics, universal equality, I would say is an ally. And for example, David Harvey in his book about Enigma of Capital finishes the book with sort of hope that the identity politics will somehow prompt the renewal of socialism. But there is a different type, which I describe as B, exceptionalism of the oppressed group. From this perspective, is at best diversion, at worst an enemy, due to legitimizing the capitalist status quo as a just system which fights discrimination. So to summarize, I will argue that there are advantages, but also disadvantages of identity politics. Advantage or promise of identity politics is giving visibility and voice to silenced and oppressed minorities, or even majorities such as women, recognition of the issues leading to oppression, and building solidarity on the basis of this common ground. But there is also a disadvantage and risk. It consists of competing for this, what I describe, the most victimized award, losing a larger picture of inequalities while pursuing a goal pertaining to a small group, and these groups obviously can fragment practically forever, and strengthening the grip of neoliberalism, which I see as the universal oppressor. Okay, thank you.